Thank you all for coming. Please go ahead and have a seat. Thank you so much for coming. If you're filling out continuing education credits, those are over here next to Tracy. Thanks for waving, Tracy. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Simon Bussiere. I'm an assistant professor of landscape architecture and urban design here at CAP. And as the speaker series coordinator for the Department of Landscape Architecture, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Peter Walker. Educated at the University of California, Berkeley, and at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Walker has designed hundreds of projects, taught, lectured, written, and served as an advisor to numerous public agencies. The scope of his work is expansive, from the design of small gardens to the planning of cities. Co-founder of the firm Sasaki, Walker & Associates, established in 1957, Walker opened its West Coast office, which became the SWA Group in 1976. As principal, consulting principal, and chairman of the board, he helped to shape the SWA Group as a multidisciplinary office with an international reputation for excellence in environmental design. In 1983, he formed Peter Walker & Partners, now known as PWP Landscape Architecture. Mr. Walker has served as consultant and advisor to numerous public agencies and institutions: the Sydney 2000 Olympic Coordination Authority, the Redevelopment Agency of San Francisco, the Port Authority of San Diego, Stanford University, the University of California, the University of Washington, and the American Academy in Rome. He played an essential role at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University as both the chairman of the Landscape Architecture Department and the acting director of the Urban Design Program. He was head of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley from 1997 to 1999. A fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and the Institute for Urban Design, Walker has been granted the Honor Award of the American Institute of Architects, Harvard Centennial Medal, the University of Virginia's Thomas Jefferson Medal, the ASLA Medal, and the International Federation of Landscape Architects Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Gold Medal. He is co-designer with Michael Arad of the National September 11th Memorial. My introduction to his work came when I was a student at UMass, Amherst. My professor, Joe Volpe, who was a student of Hideo Sasaki's, like Pete, assigned readings from Sasaki, from James Rose, Garrett Ekbo, among others. And in going down that rabbit hole, I uncovered this book, Invisible Gardens, The Search for Modernism in the American Landscape, a book that fundamentally changed the way I saw design and education. Later as a GSD student, I remember taking in the simplicity and the magic of Tanner Fountain, a place that was so striking to me, not as a landing spot like so many landscapes for another thing like a building or an other object, but as a highly visible and impactful work of landscape media that stands on its own to this day. Exposure to modern landscape architecture was a really big deal for me. It was reaffirming and it was motivating, and it set me on the path that I find myself on today. It drove me to go chase down practice in Melbourne and try to follow that legacy. And I think it was ultimately the freshness and the search for authenticity that was so meaningful to me. And I think it means a lot to each subsequent generation of landscape architects who know that this field is an evolving thing and that they can take charge of that. And that they're responsible for making it new each time they get the chance to, making it new and unique. You guys don't just repeat steps that you were taught in a vocational or in a formulaic sense, and instead your imagination can be propelled by what you came, or what came before you, and that I think frees you to be really original and unique. Just to paraphrase a line from your book, Ekbo likened the entire modern movement in the 20th century to a stream of tradition, momentarily checked by impediments in its path. That stream would eventually burst forth with renewed vigor. Thus, the serious and intelligent modern artist does not reject tradition, he only rejects imitation of past segments of the stream. Ekbo argued for a continuous flow, regarding some of the past segments in the landscape tradition as merely frozen pools or stagnant reservoirs, which are apt metaphors for pictorialism, the historic styles, and old dichotomies of formal versus informal designs. Mr. Walker's work has been flowing from him for decades. Each work is unique and lucid and visible, both at the same time bold and tactile, and in making work that really understands the nature and problems of our time, he's transformed our discipline and the world around us. We're honored to have you here with us today, sir. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Walker.
Thank you for those kind words. Can you hear me all right? Way up there? What I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk to you about the memorial, but I'd also like to talk to you about some of the things that prepared us to do this project and some of the things that which were brought to bear first really on this project or in their completeness. Before that, I want to, some of you I think know John Russell. We're here when John was here. He was a classmate of mine at Berkeley, and when I was wandering around the campus yesterday, I chanced on this little courtyard, and I thought, my, that's an interesting courtyard. And then I went over and read the plaque, and it was in honor of John Russell, which I knew John when he was a young man, and I was a young man, and it's hard to imagine either of us getting any honor at all, given our behavior in those days. But so let me get back to the memorial. The thing I always say about the memorial to begin with is that it was on television. Everyone in the United States knew about it and had actually watched it. That 51 minutes, that was played over and over and over again. Everyone saw the first plane. Everyone saw the second plane. Everyone saw the two towers come down. Now, I think most people would agree it's not the most awful thing that ever happened in the history of the world, but it was one of the most immediate. And for Americans, it happened to us, and it happened right there, and we saw it. So this has a symbolic meaning to us because we'd always been separated by these oceans. All of our wars, everything that's happened to us happened someplace else, to someone else. So this was had a kind of immediacy which I think has caught us up. I think we feel more strongly about it simply for that information. Michael Arad was a young architect, just 30 years old, when he called me up one day in my office in San Francisco, and he lives in New York. And he told me that he was one of 8 finalists in the competition for doing the memorial. Now, I'd seen all the competition entries. I'd read them, they were in a magazine, but I didn't know which one Michael had done. I didn't know which one was his. And so I said, well, look, this is a big step, this is a big job, and I need to talk to my partners before I tell you, and I'll call you back. So we went to the website, as people do, and we looked at the 8 finalists, and Michael's was probably the only one that I think we could have been really much help on. The rest of them had already sort of landscape ideas. They were all inherent. They were all tangled up in them. But Michael's was essentially these 2 holes. They're each an acre, 200 feet on a side. You go down, his idea is you go down these ramps and you get into the interior of this memorial, and the waterfalls that are coming down the outside of the void is falling, and the names would be in front of the waterfalls down below. Now, that's a pretty complicated thing, and I was drawn to it. I thought it was a really powerful idea. But what was more powerful to me was that the voids looked very much like a Michael Heiser sculpture, and I collect modern art, I collect minimalist art, and I knew about Michael Heiser. This is at Dia Beacon. Some of you may have seen it. And it was this business of taking the vacancy and making it objective. In a sense, making nothing into something. And that's what Heiser does. He cuts holes in things, he cuts holes in the ground, and so forth. And this particular piece of Heiser's is in a concrete floor in the basement of the beacon. and you walk across this floor, and then suddenly, this isn't an acre square, but it's big. You walk across the floor, and suddenly the floor is gone. And it's a real gulper. You know, you really feel it. And I've seen it a number of times. It always hits me. And when I saw that that was what Michael was dealing with, Michael Arad now was dealing with, I thought, boy, I really want to be part of that. Now, I mentioned I've been collecting modern art, and I've been particularly engaged with a group of minimalists. And I've just shown you three here. These are all Carl Andre. And the first one is just a plain old meadow, surrounded by trees, and then probably not so different from a lot of meadows that people go through or see. But then he put these railroad ties across, this gesture all across the meadow. And it doesn't matter whether you walk in here or ride a horse in here or ride a bicycle in here, you're never going to forget that meadow. And I was fascinated with the fact that this simple move could make that meadow unique in the world. And it's stuck in my head. So I looked into other things that he had done, and the thing that most people think of as a Carl Andre are these plates of metal that are laid out in a checkerboard, and they're generally maybe 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch high, and nothing else. And like a great carpet in a huge room, they command the space on top. So they're, like Heiser, they're working with non-space, but they're making it into something, again, if you focus on it, you don't forget. This last one I saw in Portland, Oregon, in a gallery, and I walked in that door and looked, and there was nothing on the wall. There weren't no paintings, nothing on the walls. And on the floor were a series of concrete blocks with a pebble on top of each concrete block. Just the whole room full of these concrete blocks. And again, what caught me about this is it seemed to me that these were all about landscape. But I couldn't figure out how you'd make a landscape out of a checkerboard or how you'd make it out of a railroad ties across some space. And certainly I didn't see how you could make a garden out of concrete blocks with a pebble on top. So even though in metaphoric terms, I kind of understood these things, in practical terms, I didn't know what to do as far as the landscape is concerned. The other thing about these that have always impressed me, and I've seen the drawings that these men have made, or that Andre and Judd and Flavin have made, and they're just little simple drawings in a notebook. Now when we were doing a job, we'd have 150 pages of working drawings to get the thing done. And I just can't imagine something this powerful could be done on one page of a notebook with a ballpoint pen. So that was another curious thing about them. In 1978, Bill Johnson is a close friend of mine. We'd gone to school together at Harvard, and he was then Dean of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan, took a group of students, 10 or 12 Michigan students and 10 or 12 Harvard students, and we decided we would go to France. And we landed in Tours, down the Loire Valley, and we essentially took the students up and we looked at all the chateaux along the way, these beautiful, fantastic gardens. And I was sitting one day after the students were wandering around in Vaux, and I used to have hair, here I am, and I was looking out over this thing, and it suddenly occurred to me that 300 years before, Lanotte had solved the problem I was struggling with, which is if you make the garden flat, then you can put gumdrops on them, people look good, parterres, sculpture, anything you put on these flat surfaces really counts. And he also has a series of interruptions where you'd come to the edge, it would drop down, and then you'd go on. And suddenly these artists, what they were doing, and gardens came together. There should be a little light bulb over my head. But that was the day that I got the idea of how you could carry these things forward. So Martin Schwartz and I were on that trip, and we came back, and we were then living in a townhouse in Back Bay, Boston, on Marlborough Street. And we had a roof that leaked, and we had to get a new roof on it, and we had to get essentially tar and gravel roof. It was a pretty flat roof. The building was 25 feet wide and about 75 feet long. Nothing much, no different from a lot of other buildings around. But we decided to make a garden on top. And this was a garden that wasn't going to be made out of plants. It was going to be made out of other things. But it was going to use Lenote's idea of foreshortening and also use the idea of Andre and Judd to try and make a garden. Now, this was the first time we were struggling with, or tried, to actually transfer those ideas into a garden. And we did it with astroturf and pots and one thing and another. I just talk about two things. In French gardens, they have what they call bassins, and they're essentially big pools, and they're generally still, and they reflect the sky. And we couldn't hold water on top. We couldn't afford it anyway. So we got these mirrors, and they reflected the sky. And we actually changed them once, and we made them the same proportion as the windows across the way, so that at night when we were having cocktails up here, when the sun was going down, these windows would come on, and so you'd see these rectangles coming across the garden, and then you'd see these rectangles all over Back Bay, because Back Bay has the same proportions, building after building. And the other thing we noticed is that when the shadow fell across these things, they still reflected the sky. Now that's pretty complicated. I mean, it's a simple little thing, but it's much more complicated than any garden I'd done to that date. Martha found out that you could, and I'm sure most of you know this, that you can get flower pots in 1-inch diameter. You can get them from 14 or 16 inches across down to 2 inches. And so if you put the big ones in the back and then keep using smaller ones, you get a forced perspective. Now Lenote does that in garden after garden, but we were just exploring it here. We didn't know what to do with the inside of the pots. So we talked about stone, little pebbles, we talked about little plants, we talked about all kinds of things, and we finally decided to paint the inside the color of the sky. So that in a sort of painterly way, they were doing the same thing that the mirrors were doing in a natural way. So what this was doing is this was starting to make us think about gardens in a completely different way. And so we sort of kept on trying. The next one I want to show you was at MIT in the Great Court. You can see the dome over here. And Dan Kiley has done this. There are a series of hedges, and he planted these things, and he had made the original garden. And they have ceremonies out here. They have graduation in the Great Court. Right across from MIT, from the front door, there was this building called the New England Confectionery Company. And the candy that they made is called Neckos. I'm sure you've all seen what a Necco is, little round things like this, and they're in different colors, and they have powdered sugar on the outside. So we went over to the factory and talked them out of 5 or 6 boxes of Neckos, and came back, and our Harvard students, and we laid them out in a grid. And then Martha's sister and her boyfriend found a whole bunch of spare tires, and we painted them exactly the same color as the Neckos, this sort of sugary pastel color, and put them into a grid which was slightly off. You have to think about the Russian constructivists. And that was put out about 6 o'clock in the morning. A whole bunch of us came out with our candy and spare tires and so forth. And when the students came to school that morning, they saw this in the big court. And this had been sponsored by a friend of ours, Kathy Halbert, who at that time was running the museum at MIT. She's now at MoMA. The students were really angry. They thought this was really frivolous, and you don't do this kind of thing at MIT. I mean, they're engineers, and they know better than this. On the newspaper, they said an affront. And then down in the story, they said, this is taking food away from starving people, and, it went on and on and on. And I called up a friend of mine who's kind of in the art world, Frank Gehry in Los Angeles. I said, Frank, this is not what landscape's supposed to be. Landscape's supposed to make people happy, and it's supposed to be calm and so forth, and these people are all really angry with us. He said, no, wait a minute, you've got something here. Keep going. This is just kindergarten, but you should keep on going. So we did. Now gradually, this kind of thinking, which in these little experiments seems kind of radical, maybe it doesn't seem radical today, but it was certainly radical then, crept into some of our other work. And let me show you 2 or 3 projects how we used this idea of flatness. This is the Nasher Sculpture Garden in Dallas. And this is the Renzo Piano building, the museum, and then this is where the sculpture is placed. And it's a really, just one city block. Here's the Dallas Museum of Art, which is 2 city blocks. And the garden can really only hold, maybe 23, 24 sculptures. Ray has 600 sculptures, most of them, 600 pieces of art, most of them sculptures, most of them of a scale that would go outside, and most of them of museum quality. I mean, really high level, a great collection. So what he wanted to do was put them out on this lawn, or what we made into a lawn, to have something that really said garden, but was a comfortable place for sculpture to be placed. Now, if you think about sculpture, sculpture is generally placed on a flat plane. And it's the verticality of the sculpture which sits on that plane. And it's referencing vertically what the plane is showing horizontally. Again, the Lenote thing. Even sculpture that tips, take a Serra that kind of glides through and tips at you, it's referencing that vertical. Because the only way you know it tips is because it's moving off the vertical. And much sculpture does that. It gestures one way or another. But it's all playing with this assumed verticality. In order to do this, we had to make special kind of dirt. Because we couldn't have any catch basins. You couldn't have drainage which moved into the catch basin. You couldn't have planoplanes and so forth. So we needed to have it pretty much flat. So we developed a soil, with our soil scientists, developed a soil that would let water go through it. A lot of sand, a lot of shale in it, so that the water just simply went down and could be dead level. And then the drainage was at the bottom, 6 feet down, and would take the water out. So we had a little technological thing to accomplish this. Here's the flat lawn. Now, a garden for sculpture is a very special thing. It can't, or shouldn't, I think, be a piece of sculpture itself. I think many architects, going back to Frank Lloyd Wright, have tried to make sculpture to hold sculpture. It's generally very difficult, and the sculptors hate it, of course. So what we were trying to do was make something that would hold sculpture. And so when you go in, I think of it more like a theater. And in a theater, what you're really interested in is the players. You want to see the play. And so no matter how beautifully proportioned, and this is something good architects know, that can be very beautifully proportioned, but it can still be neutral, leaving the artist to be the player, leaving the artist to do the crazy thing. And so that's essentially what we tried to do. And these are the pieces on the first show was laid out. Now, that doesn't mean that the garden doesn't go through the seasons. It still does the things that gardens do. And it doesn't mean that the trees have no meaning of their own. But it simply means that you have to put a few elements out there that make spaces of different scales, because the sculptures are all of different scales. If you think about a museum, they can put up walls that can make these different scales, but you can't build a wall and then take it out and put it in an outdoor garden. So we have a series of hedges and a series of lines of trees. A friend of mine, Doug Christmas, who runs the Ace Galley in New York and also in Los Angeles, he said, Pete, if you put a grid out there, the sculptors will love you, because they like to play off regularity, not just flatness against verticality, but also, they like rooms. They've been brought up in these white galleries and in museums. And some of them like to go over in a corner. Some of them like to go across a corner. Some of them like to stick out from a wall. So we had to have enough differentiation of scale to hold all these different kinds of sculptures. The next project I want to talk about is Sony Berlin with Helmut Jahn. Helmut and I have had a kind of strange love affair going on now about 15, 20 years. And we've gotten to the point where we trust each other enough so we can play back and forth. He can accept crazy ideas that I have. I can accept crazy ideas that he has. And you can put them together in interesting ways. What Helmut was doing here is he was building a great big space around, surrounded by these buildings, and then a tent on top. Now for scale, that's about 350 feet, about the size of a football field, but in an oval. And then at the base of the oval here, there's a flat plane because it's on top of parking garages, and they have it's Sony, so they have a multiplex theater down inside. And so instead of having a sign and a staircase going down, what Helmut and we worked out was that we would have a hole in the ground that you could look down into. And if you're down here, you're in the lobby of the theater and you can look up. And if you're up here, you can look at the hole and see the theater below. So when you're above, you look down through this garden, and there's this fountain which cantilevers out, and it has about 6 inches of water in it, and it has a glass bottom. So when you're down in the lobby below and you look up, you look through the fountain and all the way up to the tent on top. So here what we were doing is not just trying to make something flat. We were trying to make it flat and then have a vertical axis that goes all the way through, a visual axis, a line of sight that goes all the way through, from the top of the tent down into the lobby below. This was a competition we won in Japan. We're working with Yoji Sasaki, who was a student of mine, great friend, landscape architect, and also an architect there. And in Japan, all the major corporations have an in-house architect. And this is the telephone company. They call it NTT, and they are the architect that does all the work for the telephone company. And they were wonderful to work with. This was the time of postmodernism. And there are about 600 competitors. And everyone was swirling around and breaking up and deconstructing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And our scheme was simply an orchard of Zelkova with a couple of holes cut in them, on top of a building that had a food court and restaurants down below. And it was in a glass building. And the trees are growing here in dirt, which is shown through the spandrel here. So you can see the dirt coming up again, a little like an ant farm. You know, we see the ants moving around behind the glass. And here's that spandrel that moves across. And everything else was made out of glass. Now, this is probably the only absolutely flat plaza outdoors in the world, because we made it out of half stone and half tree grates that went the whole length of the plaza. And the water would come down and hit the plaza and drain down, feed the trees, and then be drained out below. And each tree sits on top of a column. So there's a column under every single tree here down below. Big, coordinated kind of thing. Not very many architects would sit still for working that hard to get something crazy like this to happen. And this is 240 match Zelkovas, probably the most beautiful match trees we've ever worked with. And all it is the trees. So there's nothing else. And in Japan you can do this because people have an attitude, an artistic attitude about nature itself. So they would come out at different times of the year, and as the trees changed, they would watch that change. And because there's nothing but the trees, then that became, an orchard of trees, then that became an object in their minds. It had moved into objective status. And we have a train station, we have the largest arena in Japan, we have the highest, tallest building in Japan, all going around, but the Japanese put out this competition to be the center of this neighborhood. And what happens in Japan is that even with they've got the best transportation system in the world, they can't get people into their urban centers and out again. So now they're doing sub-centers outside of Tokyo. This is about 45 minutes outside of Tokyo. So imagine building the plaza first and then building all the buildings around. That hadn't happened since Olmsted was doing these great campuses where he'd build the lawn first and then they'd build the buildings around the lawn. It's a very good idea, but it slipped out of everyone's consciousness. One place has a plaza, and we use these cylinders of glass so that, and the food court is below. So in the daytime, the light comes down through the glass and brings light down to the food court. And at night, the electric light comes up and essentially makes that plaza into something that's a wonder. And they have boat shows, they have ice skating, they have dances, they have everything on this. And all this plaza is just simply this light exchange going, even when they're having ice skating there, the light comes up through the ice. It's an extraordinary thing. So as you can see, we were sort of fooling around to see what we could do with this idea of flatness. What are the various landscape applications of that particular concept? So now back to the memorial. I was in Switzerland and attending a client on a Friday, and Michael called me and said, we've got to get the jury now wants to talk to us, and they want to talk right away. And I said, look, I'm busy. I got a paying job. I got to work on it. How about setting up a telephone conversation with the jury? Now, this is a remarkable jury. There were 20 people on it, and the jury sat for almost 15 months, steadily sitting. So after they got to the finals, they sat with each of the 8 finalists and kept the jury going to sort of interact so they would have some kind of client. And what the client, this is ultimately coming from the mayor, what the client was asking for is that the memorial not take over the whole space. It's 7 acres. And 7 acres in the middle of downtown Manhattan is simply too much to give over. So what the mayor wanted is he wanted something that would work as a memorial. I mean, they loved the Boyds, but they hated this idea of a big stone plaza. So our job was to somehow make a park, but a park that could work as a memorial and could also work as a public open space where one function didn't counter the other function. And that was our basic job. And Michael had made some models, and they looked like this, and they look like sophomore models. I mean, you're in school, you have seen these models everywhere all down the hall. But the jury wasn't buying it. So we got on the phone, and the question essentially was, can you do these 2 things? Can you put these 2 things together in a complementary way? And of course, we were petitioners, and we said, sure, we can do that. I'm sure we can do it. Now, I had I had 3 or 4 friends, Maya Lin and Michael von Bockenberg. I had some people on the jury, and they were basically saying, I don't think you can do it. But I think we persuaded them a little bit that night, and hung up, and it was 7 o'clock at night in Switzerland, in Basel. And I went to bed, and at 3 in the morning, phone rings, Michael's on, he says, no, they want to sit down with you, they want to sit face to face. And I said, look, I'm through with my client, I'll fly back on Saturday, and we can meet them Sunday morning. Can you imagine a jury that's willing to meet Sunday morning? I mean, this is just impossible. But these people were really diligent. This is a huge project, they were committed to it, a great bunch. So I flew back, and I was staying in a hotel on 44th Street, And I called Michael up and I said, look, Michael, we're going in. This is getting serious. We're getting toward the end of this thing. Up until then, we'd never met. We'd never met face to face. Everything had been done, by faxing back and forth and telephone calls and one thing another. So I said, how about coming over at 6:30 in the morning and we'll meet in the coffee shop of the hotel. Bring all your models and bring the drawings. And there was one guy who was hung over in one end of the coffee shop. We had it pretty much to ourselves. And we rolled out all the drawings on the floor and went around to get our story straight, because we didn't want one of us contradicting another, because we didn't necessarily agree on everything. And it had snowed that night. And I don't know if ever you've been in New York where there's just a couple of inches of snow on the ground, and before the taxis and buses get in there, this surreal, it seems quiet. All the buildings, but it just seems quiet. So we got a taxi and we drove out through this really surreal flat landscape to Gracie Mansion, where the mayor wasn't living because he's rich, and but they were holding the jury there. So we went in, and the woman who was running the competition for the LMDC, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, said, Michael, let Pete answer this question. So we went in, and that was the question. They were asking for a guarantee. And we talked about it a little bit, and I said, look, I don't know the exact answer, but I know we can find an answer to this. And I told them about some of the things that we've been doing. So we went home. I went back to California. Michael went home to New York. The following Tuesday, we got a call from the LMDC, and they said, you may have won, but we have some provisos. They said they wanted to make sure that we didn't fight these buildings, because they were going to be other kinds of museums that were going to be on the site. And Michael didn't like them. I didn't like them much either. But we had to guarantee that we would not attack those buildings and make trouble. And the other proviso was that we couldn't fire each other. We had to stay together through the whole thing, joined at the hip. Neither one could dominate the other, and neither could quit. And there were times when both of us wanted to quit each other. So we said, sure, we'll do that. Again, we're petitioners. And so they said, okay, we're going to get our lawyer to write a letter, and you guys are going to sign it. So they got a letter, faxed it out to us. We both signed it, faxed it back, and we'd won. This is on a Tuesday. The following Tuesday, they had set up, I don't know whether they knew we were going to do it or not, but they set up a press conference, not just a press conference for the New York press or the architectural press, but a press conference for all the world press. And we had 1 week. We had those little models and a couple little sketches. That was really all we had. So we had 1 week to get this thing ready to present to the world. So we got renders. Michael found some renders that were willing to work on such a crazy basis. And then we were going to build a model. And this is the first drawing of the memorial that I made. And it was made in the same scale as the model. And I put the centers in of all the trees, this sort of basic idea of these lines of trees. And then we put that on the model, and then the model maker pushed the trees through those holes. And that's how he essentially marked where the trees were going, because we didn't have anything better than this to work with. It was going along pretty well, and then the model maker said, well, look, I've only got half the trees that you've got on your little drawing. And Michael said, well, we don't need it. We'll just space them out. I said, wait a minute, Michael. This is about these voids and these trees and this flat plane. So the model maker got the guy who was making trees for him and got him to work all night long. And the following morning at 10 o'clock, he had enough trees to fit all the holes. Because up until then, they didn't know how many trees there would be, because we didn't have a drawing that showed how many trees. So the renderings were done, and the model was done. And we had this huge, I don't know how many the press, hundreds of them from everywhere. I never done anything like that before. This is really weird stuff. We were on all the morning shows. We were just like celebrities. We were going everywhere. And I remember we were sitting in the green room, and Michael's father had been ambassador to the United Nations. So he had a lot of friends in New York, and one of his friends was a high-powered public relations guy, same one that handles Frank Gehry's stuff. And they sent a wonderful woman over to us to help us. And she told us the most magic thing I've ever heard. She said, look, each of you sit down and write 2 paragraphs, 2 separate paragraphs, not in sequence. And no matter what question they ask you, answer with one of those paragraphs. And I said, you got to be kidding. That's ridiculous. She said, no, you have to remember that the journalists and the people on TV, they don't care what you're going to say. They just want conversation. So I had much trepidation, but we went through the Today Show. We gave our little paragraphs. We made them a little better as we went along, but basically we got through the whole damn thing by this process. And I've used it ever since. It really works. Anyway, that happened. It was a monster thing. I went home, and we're an office that makes models. And up until then, that little model that we'd made was nothing. It was just a quick presentation model. So first thing we did was make a detailed model at 8 scale. And the reason we wanted it to be at 8 scale is we wanted to be able to look through it. And I was worried that if you put too much benches and various things, any shrubbery and so forth, that you wouldn't have that flat plane. Because the flat plane was what makes the voids powerful. And so we designed this thing on this 8 scale model. One of my ideas in my one paragraph is the trees are organized in such a way that if you look at them from north and south, you see a forest. It's just sort of irregular. And you turn 90 degrees and they become colonnades, like Gothic colonnades. But I didn't know whether that worked. So we made a much more detailed model. And there's the shot from north and south, and this is the one from east and west. So that when you go to the memorial, when you walk in, take a look at that and see whether it works. I think it works. Then Danny Liebskin came out, and he was the master planner for the whole memorial site, the whole area, including all the buildings around. And he came out to Berkeley, and Michael came out to Berkeley, and Danny was really nice to us, but he said, you guys are in lots of trouble. You're trying to make this flat plane, and below it are chiller plants, parking garages, subways, a shopping center, and they have to have air coming in, and they have to have air going out. And they needed 17 vents. And these vents had to be 40 feet high because they were very concerned about somebody throwing a hand grenade in, so they had to be higher than you could throw. And that was what we were facing. So I said, look, this is ridiculous. This is not what we've said we were going to do. This is really impossible. So we made this model, and we made all the objects in the plaza bright orange. And we took it on the plane and went back. And Governor Pataki was the governor at the time, and he was very interested in the memorial and he's still trying to. He wanted to run for president, and this is a big thing he could do. So he looked at it and he said, "That looks awful." And ever since we've called this the awful model. And he turns to the engineers, there are about 10 of them, from the Port Authority, and he said, "This is terrible. We can't have this." And the engineers, you could just see them. They were kind of going on one foot and another like that. And they said, "Well, sir, I think we can get rid of a couple of them. And then we can get artists to decorate the rest, and everything will be okay." He turned back to them, and I'm not a Republican, and I like Pataki personally, but that day he won my friendship. And that was, he turned to the engineer and he said, "No, get rid of all of them." And our project was saved. And they did get rid of all of them, and they put them in what they call the west vent structure. They rerouted all of them, and the plaza is generally flat. Next thing were the trees. The governor wanted the trees to come from New York and the 4 states around New York, because most of the people who had been killed were commuters, and they'd come into New York on trains. And so he sent us out, and we worked with Cornell, and we finally came up on a tree, a white swamp oak, which was going to be okay. But there weren't enough in the nurseries in the 4 or 5 states. And so we went on a search. Paul Cowie is our forester, and we went out, our staff, and they looked high and low. We got some out in farmers' fields. We dug them up. The Public Works Department in Maryland gave us 10 or 15 perfect trees. And we found we needed 425 trees, which meant that we needed 500 because we were going to lose some. And brought them all up to New Jersey in a farmer's field that they'd found, which is just about the same distance from the river as the memorial would be, only on the other side of the river. And it was amazing. They had found these trees that all had a straight leader, all had a head about the same. They looked really perfect, but they were all different sizes. What are we going to do about this? Can you imagine planting them and one's 3 times taller than another? I mean, our whole thing was based on this sort of regularity. And so we found some people, the Bartlett tree experts from Chicago, fantastic people. And they came to our nursery, and you know, it's like going to the hospital. They'd put an intravenous in you, they stuck a line into every single tree, and they fed all the little ones and starved all the big ones. And 3 years later, when we were ready to put the trees in the ground, except for the Zelkovas in Japan, they were the most perfectly matched trees that we had ever dealt with, and before or since in the United States. And so that's how we got our trees. Then I got into a big fight with everyone about monoculture. Now, you all know monoculture is bad, right? So we had a group of liquid ambers around the glade in the middle of the park. And I thought it would be wonderful because they would color up just about beginning of September so that they would turn red, and we'd have 2 different trees. And Michael hated the idea, and I tried to convince him that they were just trees. It was not going to be. He said, well, these are going to compete, and right on 9/11 they should not be competing with the names. So he went to the mayor and he got rid of the trees. So now we're back to monoculture, or we only had monoculture. So I had a friend of mine, Chris Grubbs, make these drawings. Now you have to realize New Yorkers are not nature-oriented. I mean, they know about parks, but they don't really think about nature. And so we went around. I had about, 30 or 40 meetings with different groups, showing them that trees, showing them essentially the same thing that had been accepted in Japan immediately, that the trees are really interesting, that going through the year, this park is hardly ever the same 3 or 4 weeks in a row, that they keep changing. And you go from when it starts raining and the leaves come out to the heavy summer to the fall, and then in the winter, you get, when the leaves fall, you get this sort of tracery, and that's the only time you see the buildings around, because the canopy is complete in the other times. And after all of these meetings and all of this arguing, they said, okay. Now, it's one thing to have 425 trees planted in New York. It's another thing to have them all the same size. But trees in New York last, on average, 10 years. And we were shooting for 80 to 120 years. So you're not going to just stick these things in boxes and let them go. It's not going to happen. So what we did is we worked out a system of drains. The trees are held a little high. The water drains down here, goes through the drain. From the drain goes down into these slots that are between. The trees are planted on one side of the slot, and there are slots that you can walk up and down on the other. They come down through that. Here are the balls of the trees. They come down through that. They go down into 2 50,000-gallon tanks down below. So we collect all the water that comes off the memorial, put it down in the tanks, store it, And then in August and September, when we need the water, we bring it back up. For the lawns and the trees and so forth, we bring it back up. You can do all your root pruning down below here. You can come along here and prune the trees. You can give them special feeding. In other words, it's a highly mechanized system, but if you think about it, it's a natural system. It's working with the rain. It's working with the, the only thing is this tank has become the aquifer. Now, I've tried to do this on a number of projects, and when you put a tank in, particularly a huge tank in somebody's basement, the developers all start counting how much money it's costing to store the water. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, and I had never been able to get it done. But for some reason, in the chaos that was the construction of this project, they built the tanks first. And so we got the tanks, and we have that system working. The next problem were the waterfalls. The waterfalls were going all the way around each void. That's 800 feet. 2 voids, 1,600 feet. Long, long waterfall. We've done a bunch of waterfalls, and so I know something about them. But I've never done one 1,600 feet long before. So we're working with a guy named Dan User who builds most of our fountains. Dan calculated that to get enough water to fall 30 feet and not break up, you'd need to get about 3/4 of an inch, minimum 3/4 of an inch of water across the weir so that it would fall. The amount of energy, it doesn't take any energy for the water to fall, but you've got to pump it up fast enough so that it could fall again. That's going to circulate. And at 3/4 of an inch, it was going to cost them $50 million a year for electricity. That was the end of the memorial. No one had that kind of money who was going to put that money into it. So Dan invented a weir, which is like a comb. And the water comes out, and instead of a sheet, you get these tiny little sprays that go down, and they stay together. And they're really very beautiful. And it used about 1/10 of the water that would be otherwise required. And as I say, it's about a 1-to-1 relationship. So for $5 million a year, which they do have, we can keep this water flowing and keep using the water over and over again. Again, each of these things was enough to stop the memorial and force a redesign, essentially. But each of these things was solved. I'm going to go back and say one more thing here. About this time, Michael and the architects, Davis Brody Bond, Max Bond had been a teacher for 25 years. He was a dean at CCNY, architecture dean. And I taught a lot. And I think we were supposed to be the bookends that sort of held Michael together, to keep this thing moving smoothly. And Michael and Max is a wonderful guy, sweet, patient. I'm a little less sweet, a little less patient, but still we were able to hold our group together. But there had been a problem of people going down the ramps. These are long ramps, 200 feet one way and then 200 feet back in order to get down 30 feet. It had to be ADA. And at the middle of the ramp, halfway down, because of the security, you were going to have to go through the airport experience. And they're going to frisk you and put you in a room and, all the stuff you have learned to love at the airport. And many of us couldn't see how you could keep the mood of the memorial working with this kind of thing, this abrasive thing happening halfway down. And I think it had gotten to the point where Michael was the only one who still believed that could work. But the mayor didn't believe. And so one morning in the papers we read that they decided to move the names up to the surface and get rid of the basement. And the basement is now where the museum was. There was no museum at this time. We were about 3 years in, and we have just about finished working drawings on the park part, and they were pretty far along. They were into DD, almost to the end of DD, but with the lower part. And Michael was crushed. I mean, this was half of his scheme, and you can imagine how he felt. He'd gotten so far, we'd solved so many problems, and suddenly what he thought was the most important part was being dashed and changed. And he was in bad shape. I mean, you can imagine yourself, you'd worked his life wasn't that long, but he'd worked all of his adult life on this thing. We'd been going at it for years. And he was in very, very bad shape. So the mayor came to him and said, look, Michael, I want you to work on the names. And the names are now in a parapet that run around the four sides of the voids. And Michael came up and took the challenge and did a really good job on the names, as I'll show you. Now, we had been working on the details. I say we were almost finished with working drawings. And we had worked out, these are the paving patterns. We do them in chalk out in our parking lot. These are the mock-ups that we've done with the stone. These are selecting the stone. We did I think we did 13 different schemes for the benches. Some of them looked like it had a body in it, you know. Some of them looked like they were, you know, should have had a name over it. We didn't want anything funereal there, but we wanted it formal. We worked with Paul Morantz to get a special light fixture, which would throw light in two ways because we wanted them in the lines of the trees and light the paths on either side. It has special lenses. The lights also have cameras in them. When you go out there, if you look carefully, you can see the cameras, but if you don't look carefully, you won't see them. So the security is being done through the light. All of these things were being done. And we imagined it to look like this. And you can see, here are the lines of trees, here are the waterfalls. This is a building that Snowhetta did, which is actually the entrance to the museum down below, Davis Brody Bond. This is the west vent structure. All the vents were tidied up into those two structures. So we were pretty far along. There are two things about it that I like to point out. Some places inside, it looks like it's quite green. And some places looks like it's all stone. It's like an Escher. You know, if you look one direction, you see it one way. You look another direction, you see it another way. And so it goes from the slide on the right to the slide on the left as you move through the memorial. And that was our strategy for making it both a park and a memorial. And the areas around the voids are stone, and the areas beyond that are green. So this is the way we did it. And the politicians decided that they couldn't wait more than 10 years to open the memorial. And the mayor, who was just finishing his third term, and you're not supposed to have even a third term, he knew he couldn't get a fourth term, wanted to have the opening on his watch. But this is where we were. We were half built. The memorial is out here. And this is all that we had. And I was in panic because, I mean, some of these holes are 7 stories deep, and it's a real mess down here. And these are buildings under construction, buildings over here. Freedom Tower isn't finished. I mean, it was just a mess. And I was afraid, not because I didn't think it looked okay, but I was afraid that it wouldn't give that sense of tranquility that we had the voids, but we just didn't have the surrounds. And on opening day, we had 30,000 people there because there's 3,000 were killed. Their families, all the family members represent about 10,000. They let the family members and all the friends of the family come. So it was about 30,000, and all the politicians. So it was about 30,000 people the first day. And as I say, I really had stage fright. This is going to be, I thought, a terrible day. And of course, it's going to be watched by the press all over the world, and they're not the friendliest folks. But the details that were there were really beautiful. The drains, you know, were going through. The stone was done beautifully. The benches were done beautifully. Everything was being done well. We had a great stonemason. We had a lot of people working really hard to make this thing work. We had wonderful people doing the planting. So this was opening day. They let them all in here. The other worry that I had was because we only had about half the space, I thought they were going to trample it. I thought it was, you know, all the plant material was going to be gone. But there was no damage at all. People were very careful. And I was really worried, you know, particularly I don't know all of, or didn't at that time know all the families, but I knew several hundred of them, particularly people who were prominent, either pro or con, politically prominent. And when we went in there, they came up and threw their arms around us, and they said, "This is really wonderful. This is what we wanted. We're really happy with it." So it's like, you know, if you're an architect and you go in and the wife comes in and loves the kitchen and the husband comes in and loves the den. You know, I mean, it's this sort of feedback. The next day, they started letting them in 2,000 at a time. And people would stay a little, not quite 2 hours. So we didn't have so many in at once. And it seemed to hold them pretty well, even the small. Although the numbers, you had to go through security, so the numbers were sort of artificially kept down. Now you can walk in from any direction. And we're in our, you know, we're going toward 30 million now. Huge numbers. We had our first fall, and the trees did their number. They were just terrific. You know, I mentioned Paul Morantz. He did the lighting. We put the lighting up in the trees so the bottoms of the trees would glow. These are about, they've been in about 18 months. I think Paul did a wonderful job with the lighting. He did a very subtle. He's the designer who did the Twin Towers of Light. You've probably seen those things. A stupendous piece of work, and they use it down in here on September 11th. But generally, everything was working pretty well. A number of things happened that we didn't really know. I mentioned that Michael had done really a wonderful job on the names. I mean, these are bronze. You lean over these things, and the names are in them. But the bronze gets so cold in the winter, they have to have a heater inside. And it gets so hot in the summer, you have to have cooling inside. So you have to, not air condition, but you have to condition the bronze because people put their hands on it, they get burned or freeze. But what was interesting was that they started putting things in. I don't know why we didn't think about this, because they do this at Vietnam, they do this at the Anzac Memorial and so forth. But this was a level of detail that we hadn't imagined. And the other thing, I think Michael knew they were going to do this, but I hadn't thought much about it. They make the rubbings. And people come, and there's always something like this going on. When the president walked across, he was the first one in. The politicians were not allowed to make speeches. The president said a poem. They just read the names. Have any of you been to one of the celebrations? They just read the names. And it takes about 4.5 hours to read the 3,000 names, and it's read by people in the families. Some of the families are, you know, kids that were so small when it happened, they've grown up because this has been going on for 10 or 12 years. But the president walked across, and he was sort of, we were watching, we were up high. He was sort of doing it for everybody. You know, he walked across, walked underneath the trees, looked at the names, and looked into the boys. The people on the Freedom Tower hung this great flag, and I'm not an America Firster, but you know, it seemed right. It seemed okay because there was an awful lot of patriotism involved in this rebuilding. But finally, I think most of us who have worked on it, including the contractor and the construction people and so forth, figured that our client, we have 27 agencies that reviewed our work, from the federal government all the way down to the city government, 27 agencies. And it's been going on now 13 years. And it just finished. The last tree went in 2 weeks ago, so it's now completed. But I think everyone agrees that because it was such a multiplicity of clients, that it was really the families. If the families sort of said, yeah, that's okay, that's really good, I think we all felt that we'd done, you know, had a good run and done our job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us. We have a few minutes for questions. If there's questions from the crowd. or balcony? Yes, ma'am.
I've always admired the way that you conceive of construction details and the materials to make those details work. Can you speak to your design process, and at what point in your process do you start to consider materials and details?
Well, this process went on so long, it seems like we were doing it forever. But on most projects, you start selecting generic materials during schematics. And you get very serious about materials and dimensions in design development. And because sort of halfway through design development, you can't escape costing. So you need to give very detailed information to get the costing done properly. So I would say those decisions are somewhere between the middle of schematics and the middle of DD, which doesn't mean that you're over, because it's so simple. You put stone together with metal and so forth, but the connections and the details. And then underneath that is plumbing, electricity, all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot to go. And my view is that that's all designed. It's not like you hand it over to somebody and they whip out a set of working drawings. It doesn't really work that way. And in our office, the designers watch that all the way through. And in construction. I mean, we would get calls over the period 5 years of construction. We would get calls from our field guys saying, something's wrong here. We can't figure out what we should be doing at this point. And they'd take photographs and send them, and we'd respond. Or if it was really serious and it was something that was happening over and over and over again, we'd go back and try to figure it out. It's a better system in Japan, partly because the contractors are better, but also because they have a little group of architects they put on every single project. So if we're working with Taniguchi, he'll have 5 or 6 people right in they'll have a little shack, not just a construction manager, but somebody who's an architect who could design these things. And as the problems come up, they solve them. Most of the difficulty, I would say, doesn't come from not having thought things through. It comes from having something that you didn't expect. Like, for instance, 2 subcontractors get into a fight. One is supplying the dirt, one is supplying the tree. The tree guy says the dirt's no good, the dirt guy says the tree's, like that. And you spend an awful lot of time adjudicating these differences. We had on this one a very bad contractor to supply the dirt, and as you can imagine, we had very special dirt. It was highly specified. And there was a contractor who was doing it from the outer skirts of Brooklyn, and he was bringing in bay mud. They were just scooping it up and putting it in the trucks and bringing it over. And we were rejecting it. And they took a couple of trucks back, and then about the 3rd truck they said, no, you're too fussy. This is perfectly good soil. It's dirt. See, black, it looks like dirt. And we said, no, you can't do that. It turned out they were mafia. And the things that they were threatening to do, first suing you and stopping the job, getting an injunction, this dirt was going to stop the whole parade. So they gave them $250,000 to go away. And they took all the dirt out and got a new contractor and got new dirt. Got very good dirt, actually, as it turned out. The trees are growing about twice as fast as one would expect. Very similar to Nasher. The Nasher trees grew at about twice the rate, which is almost a problem. You're going to have to slow them down. But most of the problems come there. The other problems that come is from the bureaucracy. Somebody comes in with a rule that was written somewhere that we didn't catch it, and you have to go and deal with the rule. You try to get them to take it back, or if they won't do that, you have to try and find in the design to work with that. But they don't come so much from the details, they come from the process. The process is really difficult. And it went on, everyone was exhausted. People no longer even wanted to argue with each other. We'd certainly worn out all the goodwill you could imagine. And part of our problem, the reason it took so long, is the Calatrava, who was doing the station next to us, across the street, and their mezzanine was connected to the shopping center. And so we could have built this thing in 3 or 4 years, but we couldn't get the ground available to build it because they had to finish the subway, they had to finish the shopping center, they had to finish the station before we could get access to the top of the ground so we could start building. So that was a lot of the delay.
Do we have another question?
I was wondering if you had some sort of a fund built into this memorial that, so it will have perpetual maintenance, so 80 years from now.
It's a very good question, and it's an embarrassing question. We don't know who's going to run it. We've heard, that it was going to be given to the New York Park Department, which we were fighting because they're not, all the parks are being taken over by others, so the Park Service. Then they talked about the National Park Service. We didn't like that very well either. They're in the process now of getting together a crew, and they've got a couple of years. They've got to have maintenance for a couple of years paid for out of the contract. Now, whether this is an endowment or whether the city takes it over or whether the foundation can raise enough money for them to take it over hasn't been decided. And that's not atypical. We have the same problem in Sydney. So, people are so, concentrating on getting it done that they don't think that this has got to go on for years and years. What we're going to, I think, end up with is we're going to end up with Friends of the Memorial. We're going to end up with something like the National Park or the Central Park or Prospect Park. They have this private-public thing. There are a number of parks in New York now are being taken over by these private organizations. And that may be where it maybe should be. We'll see. I don't know the answer to the question.
Yes, in the docking.
I wanted to ask, can you hear me okay?
Barely.
Oh, okay, well, turn the volume up a bit. I wanted to ask about, you showed the 2 elevations of the trees, the north-south and the east-west. And to me, the legibility of the grid in one of the views and the subtle randomness in the other, I kind of wanted to ask you about that and how that was managed.
Well, if you think of it, it's like an abacus with the beads. You can set the beads up irregularly, but if you turn the abacus, they line up. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. So the ranges range from maybe 20 feet to 40 feet and not in a regular fashion. We did it through modeling. I mean, we made many of those models and changed them. We tried to predict how people would move through, but that's hard to do. People are really hard to manage that way. So my guess is over time, I know there are going to be some trees that die, which will change things a little bit. If the trees are on the outside and it happens in the next 10 years, they'll be replaced. If it happens 30 years from now and they're on the inside, I don't even know there's a way to replace it. Our tree moving guy has this big, like a sled, that he brings them in with rubber tires and brings them in and then tips them up. There's been a lot of technology here, the first time I've ever seen it. So maybe they can get them into the interior areas. But in some ways, if you lose a tree or two, it may be okay. It's, that if they were on a perfect grid, it would be like a tooth missing. But I think this kind is a little more forgiving than a perfect grid. I think if a tree went out in Saitama, you'd really see it. But I don't know, and I'm not probably going to see it. It's going to happen sometime down the road.
Yes.
Hi. You talked about earlier working with the judges and just designing with them and basing that off. But you said in the end it was all about the families and remembering who they lost. Did you early on go to any of the families and work with them alongside them? And
I'll tell you
see
a
what the
couple of
reaction was?
stories. When we first began, Michael and I were asked to go through this room, and they have a room at the foundation, and families have put things in the room, and it has teddy bears, and it has little, sort of scribbling things. Daddy, I hope you're happy in heaven. It's an hour in that room makes you very aware of who you're working for and what you're hoping to do. Obviously, when the mayor or the governor says something, you have to pay attention. If it's not a good thing, you have to fight it. If it's a good thing, you have to deal with it. But when you're talking about all the agencies, the police department, the fire department, the transportation authority, the redevelopment authority, the planning agency, and so forth, they're all over the lot. And different people within different agencies. And the Port Authority is they have 6,000 engineers in the Port Authority, any one of which can stand up and say, you got to change this, you got to do that. So part of it was just if we focused, we had to deal with all that, but if you focused on that in an emotional way, if you said, well, they're the guys we have to please, it'd be impossible. So I think most of us focused on those people that we thought had an emotional rather than a bureaucratic interest in the thing. And that's why most of us by the end were starting to think. Now, there were a number of people in the families who served on various committees and were wonderful people. I mean, in their, they'd lost their father or lost their mother or something, and they were they were really heroes. And I think that's why for those two reasons, we sort of focused on that. Because you need a client. I mean, you say, well, it'd be wonderful if you had no client. It's not wonderful to have no client. You need somebody to go back and forth. For those of you who have ever done a competition, the worst thing about a competition is there's no client. And you need that. That's the natural order of things, the back and forth. And we got most of what I would think of as, legitimate feedback from the families. It doesn't feel right, you take that seriously. But I think a lot of the bureaucrats, it's hard to, you can't please them. There's just too many of them. So we focused on. And then I think the emotional thing. I mean, let's face it, I started off with this TV thing. Everyone in the world saw that TV. And you can't work for everyone in the world. You have to have somebody to focus on, and the families were who we did. Now, there were some family members who didn't want a memorial, didn't want to spend the money. There were some family members who wanted, we had really terrible things. You had anti-Muslim people, some of the families took that position. Luckily, that was solved off-site. It was dealt with a different issue they focused on. But you still need somebody. And it was those several hundred that served and went all the way through it and were calm. And many of them helped us. They were terrific people. Never forget them.
Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful speech. And I have a question in general. I know you're a master in the minimalism, and I can see that you kind of use that in every detail in your design. But how do you personally understand or interpret that minimalism? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand. How do you do what?
How do you understand the minimalism? Minimalism.
Oh, minimalism.
Yeah, minimalism. Yes.
Well, I got a call from Woollen the other day, and he's giving a class at Penn, and he said, I just saw the memorial, and he said, I now know what you've been spouting about all these years. He says, it's just what you've been talking about that you wanted to do. I don't know. I don't think there's anything in there that isn't needed. I think that almost everything in there is doing 2 or 3 jobs. So it's trying to get a few things to do a lot and not having a lot of things that do very little. And I think it's that paring down. That's what it means to me, and that's what I think we've done. But I also think it has to do with proportion. It has to do with all the artistic issues as well. I don't know whether I've sold you guys on this, but I see those early experiments in this. I can just see us marching through. We learn some things, and we learn some more things, and we learn some more things. I don't think, if I'd gotten this job 20 years ago instead of 12 years ago, I don't think I would have been able to do it nearly as well. Because you do learn. You learn from trying things, and you learn from trying to develop things that are simple and direct. And I do keep that in mind.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing with us. We will be having a reception just outside in the gallery in the hallway, and we'd love for you all to come by and speak with Mr. Walker. We have, as a token of our appreciation, a book that was written by several of our faculty and displays some of the work of our students in community-based projects, and so we want to share that with you today. Thank you very much.